Imagine a silence that rings in your ears. This is not just an absence of sound, but a vacuum before a storm stretched over the Oder River. The time is 3 in the morning Moscow time, April 16, 1945. In this darkness, hidden by a thick fog, lurks a force that the history of wars has never known. 2.5 million people, 41,600 artillery pieces and mortars, more than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. All of them are waiting for one signal. The air is filled with the smell of damp earth, machine oil, and cheap tobacco. The smell of waiting for the finale. Suddenly the horizon flares up. It is not the sun. It is 140 billion lumens of electric light. 143 powerful anti-aircraft searchlights, placed every 200 meters, simultaneously cut through the night gloom, directing blinding beams towards the enemy. The effect is stunning. Shadows disappear. Space becomes flat and unnaturally bright. Following the light, sound crashes down. Thousands of guns open fire simultaneously. The earth trembles so much that soldiers in the trenches feel the vibration not with their feet, but with their internal organs. The Berlin operation has begun, the grand finale of the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, an event that would redraw the map of the world for the next half-century. But behind this facade of power lies a complex tangle of political intrigues, personal ambitions, and the colossal human price that had to be paid for the right to raise the banner over the capital of the Third Reich. To understand why this assault turned into a race against time, one must move from the mud of the trenches to the quiet offices of the Kremlin and the White House. By the spring of '45, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. The question was not who will win, but what will the world look like after the victory? Berlin ceased to be merely a military target. It became the main political prize. In early April, the Supreme Commander of the Soviet Union receives alarming intelligence. The Allies, Anglo-American forces, are preparing for a dash to Berlin. There is a risk that they will occupy the city first, and then the entire geopolitical structure of post-war Europe would not favor Moscow. Stalin summons 2 marshals to Moscow, Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev. A map is spread out on the table. The front line runs along the Oder and Neisse, just 60 kilometers from the German capital. A negligible distance for a modern army, but every meter of this path is fortified with German meticulousness. Berlin is not just a city. It is a fortress where every house is turned into a pillbox and the streets are blocked by barricades. The Supreme Commander asks one simple question. Who will take Berlin, us or the Allies? Both marshals answer unequivocally. But behind this answer lies not only patriotism, but also fierce rivalry. Stalin, a master of manipulation, erases the demarcation line between Zhukov's and Konev's fronts on the approaches to the city itself. He leaves a void, hinting, whoever breaks through first will enter the center. Thus begins the great race, a race not only with the enemy, but also among their own. The operation plan was developed in strict secrecy, but on an unprecedented scale. The idea was simple and brutal: to cut the German grouping into pieces, surround it, and destroy it, preventing it from retreating into the city for street fighting. However, reality made its adjustments already in the first hours. Zhukov's famous searchlight attack, intended to blind the enemy, played a cruel trick. Thick fog and smoke from the explosions of thousands of shells created an impenetrable veil. The light reflected from the dust clouds and hit the eyes of the advancing Soviet soldiers, not the enemy. Tanks and infantry, orienting themselves with difficulty, ran into the first line of defense. Here, on the Zilo Heights, the first drama of the operation unfolded. The Germans, anticipating the strike, withdrew their main forces from the first trench to the second, shortly before the artillery preparation began. Millions of shells plowed through empty trenches. When Soviet infantry went on the attack, they met organized, fierce resistance. The Zilo Heights are a natural barrier, steep slopes dominating the marshy Oder floodplain. German artillerymen had a perfect view. Every step came at the cost of enormous effort. The pace of the offensive, set by the Stavka, was disrupted. Zhukov, realizing that the schedule was plummeting into an abyss, and Stalin on the line demanding a report, made a risky, many would say desperate, decision. He threw 2 tank armies into battle even before the defense was breached. Imagine this scene. Thousands of tanks, steel monsters created for maneuver and open spaces, massing on narrow roads in front of the heights. They couldn't deploy. They hindered each other, becoming ideal targets for German Faustpatron and anti-tank guns. It was a moment of crisis. Fire, metal, and people merged into a single mess. Historians still debate the expediency of this decision. Could the heights have been bypassed? Could they have waited? But the logic of that war dictated its own terms. Time was more precious than metal, and the political goal justified any means. The commander of the First Belarusian Front knew that in the south, Marshal Konev's affairs were going better. Ivan Konev, commander of the First Ukrainian Front, forced the Nysa River under the cover of a unique smoke screen. Smoke stretched for hundreds of kilometers, concealing the crossings. His troops broke through the defenses faster and reached operational space. Sensing an opportunity, Konev contacted the Kremlin and offered to turn his tank armies north, directly to Berlin. Stalin gave the go-ahead. Now 2 gigantic Soviet fronts, like 2 claws of a huge crab, began to close in around the German capital. The competition entered a sharp phase. Konev's tank crews surged forward, ignoring the flanks, striving to outpace their colleagues from the neighboring front. Meanwhile, inside Berlin itself, an atmosphere of apocalypse reigned. The city, once sparkling with lights, had turned into gray ruins. The population, intoxicated by years of propaganda, lived in fear of the arrival of _0_Goebbels machine, instilled in Germans until the last days that resistance made sense, that a miracle weapon would soon appear, or that the alliance between the USSR and the West would collapse. Old men, women, and teenagers from the Hitler Youth built barricades. Everyone who could hold a weapon was rounded up into Volkssturm units. Teenagers were given disposable rocket launchers, Faustpatron, and sent to meet Soviet tanks. This was the agony of a regime ready to drag the entire nation into the grave with it. Paradoxically, the closer the end, the fiercer the resistance became. German soldiers, especially SS units and foreign volunteers, fought with the fanaticism of the doomed. They had nowhere to retreat. Behind them was only the Führer's bunker and the ruins of their ideology. For the Soviet soldier, who had traveled from the Volga to the Spree, every battle was perceived as the last step home. The psychological tension was extreme. Imagine the state of a person who survived Stalingrad, passed through the Battle of Kursk, forced the Dnieper, and now, when victory is within reach, he must stand under bullets in a foreign city. The desire to survive fought with the thirst for retribution and duty. Everyone understood, to die 2 days before the end of the war was the bitterest fate. By April 20th, Hitler's birthday, Soviet long-range artillery delivered its first strike on the center of Berlin. It was a symbolic _0_, and just a couple of days later, the encirclement closed. The city was in a trap. But this was only the beginning. The assault on a huge metropolis, a concrete jungle where every window breathed fire, lay ahead. Battle tactics changed radically. Customary chain attacks didn't work here. Assault groups were formed. A platoon of infantry, a couple of tanks, sappers, flamethrower operators, and necessarily a couple of direct fire guns. Tanks in the city are like bulls in a china shop, vulnerable and clumsy. German Panzerfaust operators hunted them from basements and upper floors. The impact of a cumulative jet burned through armor, causing ammunition detonation. Crews perished instantly. To protect the vehicles, bed frames were welded onto the armor, hoping that the grenade would detonate earlier before reaching the main metal. Tankers advanced, raising their gun barrels to the upper floors, while infantry swept through buildings, throwing grenades into basements and attics. Battles were fought not for streets, but for floors. You could occupy the first floor while Germans were still firing from the third. Walls were breached with explosives to pass through houses without entering bullet-swept streets. The situation was exacerbated by Berlin's network of underground communications. The subway, sewers, bunkers, all this created a second underground city through which the Germans could move stealthily and strike the advancing troops from the rear. At one point, by order of the Nazi leadership, the locks of the Landwehr Canal were blown up. Water poured into the subway tunnels where thousands of civilians and wounded were sheltering. This became one of the most horrifying episodes of the battle, demonstrating the complete loss of humanity by the agonizing regime. And above, another tragedy unfolded. The battle in the encirclement southeast of Berlin, in the Halbe Pocket. The German Ninth Army, the very one that had defended the Seelow Heights, found itself cut off from the city but did not surrender. Hundreds of thousands of people, military and refugees, gathered into a huge, uncontrollable mass, trying to break through to the west. To the Americans. This was a quote, one of incredible density. Soviet artillery and aviation methodically ground down this grouping. Forests burned, roads were choked with destroyed equipment. But this slaughter had strategic meaning. It prevented these units from entering Berlin and reinforcing the garrison. If 200,000 soldiers of the Ninth Army had broken into the city, the assault could have dragged on for months. By the end of April, fighting had shifted to the government quarter, the Tiergarten sector. Here, the density of defense reached its peak. Buildings were massive, with thick walls that could withstand direct hits. Luftwaffe anti-aircraft towers, giant concrete fortresses, lowered their guns and fired direct fire at Soviet tanks. In the center of this chaos was the Reichstag. The parliament building itself had long ceased to be used for its intended purpose, but for Soviet soldiers and command, it became a symbol of the _2_. Everyone aimed for it. The race between Zhukov's and Konev's armies reached its finale. Konev's troops approached the center from the south, but Stalin ordered them to stop. The honor of taking the Reichstag was given to Zhukov's first Belarusian front. This decision left a bitter taste for Konev's soldiers, who had shed blood fighting their way through the entire city, but were forced to cede the final push. The assault on the Reichstag began on April 30th. It was not a single heroic dash, as often shown in movies. It was a series of extremely difficult, exhausting attacks. The approaches to the building were blocked by a water-filled ditch, and the square was swept by crossfire. The first attempts to break through failed. People had to lie for hours under heavy fire, pressing themselves into the asphalt and broken bricks. Artillery fired direct hits at the building, tearing down columns and smashing windows. Only by evening were the assault groups able to break inside. The fighting inside the Reichstag resembled a battle in hell. Smoke, dust, darkness cut by flashes of gunfire. Screams in different languages, the echo of explosions in vast halls. The Germans resisted desperately, understanding that this was the end. Battles raged for every room, for every stairwell. And at this very time, deep underground, in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the final act of the Nazi leadership's drama was unfolding. Adolf Hitler, realizing the complete futility of further resistance and the inevitability of capture, decided to end his life. On April 30th, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, a shot rang out. The man who unleashed the bloodiest war in history left this world, leaving his people ruins and shame. But the war machine by inertia continued to operate for several more days. While the last fanatics were being finished off in the basements of the Reichstag, groups of soldiers with banners were making their way to the building's roof. Official history remembered the names of Yegorov and Kantaria, but in reality there were many groups. Everyone wanted to be first. On the night of May 1st, the red flag was raised over the dome of the defeated parliament. This was a moment of truth, not just a military victory, but an existential triumph, a sign that the system built on hatred and destruction had itself been destroyed. However, the Berlin garrison had not yet surrendered. Negotiations began on May 1st. German General Krebs, who knew Russian, he had been a military attaché in Moscow before the war, arrived at the location of the Soviet troops. He reported Hitler's death and tried to negotiate a temporary truce. The Soviet response was firm and unequivocal. Only unconditional surrender, no bargaining, no conditions. The time for diplomacy was over. Krebs returned to the bunker empty-handed. After this, Soviet artillery delivered a final crushing blow to the city center, called __0___. On the morning of May 2nd, the commander of Berlin's defense, General Weidling, signed the order of surrender. Silence fell, the very silence that millions of people had dreamed of for 4 long years. Civilians and surrendering Wehrmacht soldiers began to emerge from basements, bunkers, and ruins. Columns of prisoners stretched in an endless gray ribbon. The city lay in ruins. The casualty statistics are horrifying. The Soviet army lost more than 78,000 people irrevocably in the Berlin operation. These were those who never returned home. Almost 300,000 were wounded. German losses are difficult to calculate precisely, but they number in the hundreds of thousands, including a huge number of civilians. The main question arises, which historians and descendants discuss. Was it worth rushing so much? Was this race justified? Could they have simply surrounded the city and waited for the garrison to surrender from hunger? From a military point of view, perhaps. But war is the continuation of politics. If the Red Army had stopped, Berlin could have been occupied by the Allies. Or, even more dangerously, the Nazi leadership could have tried to conclude a separate peace with the West, splitting the anti-Hitler coalition. Stalin understood. Whoever controls Berlin dictates the rules of the game in post-war Europe. The capture of Berlin was a demonstration of the power of the Soviet Union, a signal to the whole world. It was an end to the war, and at the same time, the beginning of a new era, the era of the Cold War. The price of this demonstration was thousands of lives of young men who died just hours before peace. This is a tragedy that will always stand alongside triumph. Victors are not judged, but the price of victory must be remembered. The streets of Berlin in May 1945 are not just Chronicle footage of dancing traffic controllers and field kitchens. They are also mountains of bodies, the smell of burning, the ruined destinies of millions. But one cannot deny the grandeur of the moment. The Soviet soldier, a simple lad from Ryazan, Siberia, or Kazakhstan, accomplished the impossible. He broke the back of the most well-oiled military machine in history. He came to the enemy's lair not to destroy the German people, but to destroy Nazism. Already in the first days after the battles, Soviet field kitchens began feeding hungry Berliners. This was a powerful humanistic gesture that shattered Goebbels' myths about barbarians from the East. The Battle of Berlin became the quintessence of the entire Great Patriotic War. It focused all the skills accumulated over 4 years, the mastery of artillerymen, the daring of tankers, the self-sacrifice of the infantry, and the toughness of the command. It was an exam that the army passed with excellent from a military point of view, but paid a terrible price for it. Let's look at this experience today. What do we see through the haze of 80 years? We see how the ambitions of politicians are paid for with the lives of soldiers. We see how ideology can turn a civilized nation into a monster, ready to sacrifice its own children for phantoms of grandeur. We see that even in the very thick of hell, in the cruelest meat grinder, there is still room for heroism and humanity. When we look at the famous photo of the victory banner over the Reichstag, we must see behind it not only the joy of victory, we must feel the weight of every step on the stairs of that building. Every meter of Berlin asphalt was drenched in blood. And this race for the flag was not just a sporting competition between two marshals. It was a race against death, a desire to put an end to an endless nightmare, so that no more bombs would fall on their native land. The history of the Battle of Berlin teaches us that the conclusion of a conflict is often its bloodiest stage. A wounded beast is doubly dangerous, and when the goal is so close, the temptation to accelerate events becomes irresistible. But acceleration always comes at a price. This lesson is universal. It applies not only to wars, but also to any global crisis. The desire for a quick result often requires sacrifices that later, in the quiet of peacetime, seem excessive. But then, in the smoke and fire of 45, there could be no other logic. There was an enemy, there was a lair, and there was an order. Forward! And they carried it out to the end. In the finale, there remains an image of silence. The very same silence with which we began. But now it is a different silence. Not a tense pre-storm silence, but a tired and devastated one. A silence in which one can hear the cry of a child, the creak of a patrol's boots, and the distant rumble of trains heading east. The world had changed forever. And at the foundation of this new world lie the stones of destroyed Berlin, cemented with the blood of those who marched towards this day for 1,418 days. Their sacrifice was not in vain, for it stopped absolute evil. And to remember this means not just to know dates and figures, but to understand the nature of man, capable of both the greatest crimes and the greatest exploits. This memory is our vaccination against repetition, a vaccination whose validity, one hopes, has not yet expired.